let's talk about the WNBA Finals.
The WNBA Finals were anticipated as a pinnacle celebration of women's basketball. It was meant to showcase star power, drama, and immense passion. However, when stars A'ja Wilson and DeWanna Bonner entered arenas to find vast sections of empty seats, the truth of the situation was more impactful than any on-court competition. What was poised to be the league's most significant event devolved into an uncomfortable display. Attendance was sparse, and ticket prices were in a freefall. The vibrant energy that had enveloped Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever had vanished completely. For two of the league's most prominent players, the situation was more than just humiliating, it was maddening. Their visible frustration was captured by cameras, while microphones recorded their sharp comments on the poor fan turnout. But underneath their anger lay a more profound understanding. In the absence of Caitlin Clark, the WNBA's appeal had faded and the audience's enthusiasm had waned. The anticipation for the WNBA Finals was expected to be electrifying. It featured two dominant teams, abundant elite talent, and players of an MVP caliber vying for the championship. Yet, as the games neared, something seemed amiss. There was a lack of viral highlights dominating social media. Sports bars weren't buzzing with excitement, and arenas were far from sold out. Instead, fans browsing ticket websites were shocked. Seats for the championship games were available for as little as $35 for what is meant to be the premier event in women's basketball. It had the makings of a ghost town. Even A'ja Wilson, the star of the Las Vegas Aces and the reigning MVP, could not conceal her disappointment. She had anticipated the finals to be a loud, wild, and energetic affair, but upon walking out for warm-ups to see large empty sections of red seats, she was reportedly heard murmuring to herself, "This is the finals." This wasn't a display of arrogance, but of sheer disbelief. For years, athletes like Wilson and Bonner had strived to increase the league's profile. Now they found themselves playing in front of a sparse crowd, with cameras unable to hide the empty stands. Wnba Bonner was also vocal about her feeling. After the first game, her frustration was palpable during the post-game interviews. Her team had given their all, but the silence from the spectators was overwhelming. "You worked your whole career for moments like this," she stated, her voice edged with sharpness, "and you just hope people care enough to show up." That one statement captured the heavy emotional toll.
I believe y'all don't care. I think y'all care about the drama around it. I do believe that. But I don't think you care about the events itself. And judging by ticket prices, neither does anybody else.
Behind the scenes of the finals, the players were coming to the real-time conclusion that the excitement around the league was perhaps more delicate than they had imagined. On social media, the lack of enthusiasm was quickly noted by fans. Pictures of vacant seats became viral, igniting discussions about the cause of the poor turnout. Some attributed it to expensive tickets. Others criticized the league's promotional efforts. A significant number, however, pointed to a single notable absence from the finals. The rookie, Caitlin Clark, had sparked a renewed interest in women's basketball throughout the season. Her games with the Indiana Fever consistently attracted record attendance and high television viewership. Without her, the finals appeared to have lost their allure.
If ever there was proof that the Caitlin Clark fans / Fever fans are now the overwhelming majority of the fandom, look at ticket prices for finals games. Game 1, the get-in price for Game 1 matchup between the Aces and the Mercury for a WNBA Finals game. Holy hell, there's $35 seats right there. Right there. Plenty of good seats available.
Meanwhile, league officials attempted to control the narrative, framing it as a compelling series between two legendary teams. But the fans were not convinced. They sought passion, compelling narratives, and a reason to be invested, which the league failed to provide on this occasion. The finals, intended to be the zenith of the sport, instead revealed a difficult truth. The WNBA's popularity was still heavily dependent on a small number of captivating personalities. Without them, the momentum dissipated after the first game. The internet quickly dubbed it the most subdued finals in the history of the WNBA. The atmosphere in the arena was indicative of a larger problem. Not a deficiency of talent, but a deficit of connection. The stars were performing brilliantly, but the audience was absent, and this harsh reality was about to push A'ja Wilson and DeWanna Bonner to their limits.
Look at that. Wow. $35 whole dollars. This might be the best part of the video for the WNBA, because when you gauge the interest, to gauge the interest of this series, and it was ugly. With DeWanna Bonner, Alyssa Thomas, and the Mercury in the finals against A'ja Wilson and the Aces, will you be locked in watching this series? Question mark. Yes or no? Hit the poll. 4% of brave souls said yes. 96% said hail to the no.
Following the conclusion of the first game, what should have been a moment of pride quickly soured into a wellspring of frustration for A'ja Wilson and DeWanna Bonner. These two veteran players had dedicated themselves to leading their teams to the finals, only to be greeted by an awkward quiet and mostly empty arenas instead of applause and flashing cameras. The WNBA had held out the promise of expansion, recognition, and esteem, but it seemed as if the league had regressed in a single night. For A'ja and DeWanna, this was about more than just poor attendance figures. It was a feeling of being let down by the very supporters who, they had been told, were finally embracing the league. In the press conference that followed the game, Wilson's exasperation began to surface. Her words were carefully chosen, but her tone was laden with significance. "We're playing some of the best basketball out there," she remarked, "but it's like nobody's watching." This straightforward declaration was incredibly telling, and she was correct. Media coverage was minimal. Engagement on social media had plummeted. Clips from the game hardly created a stir, especially when compared to the viral excitement that had accompanied every action Caitlin Clark took during the season. The difference was stark and undeniable. Bonner, however, was not as reserved. She was direct, passionate, and unapologetic. "It's disrespectful," she stated. "We deserve packed arenas. We deserve to feel that energy." Her remarks quickly circulated on social media, sparking a debate among fans about whether her anger was warranted or out of line. Some contended that she and other veteran players had played a role in creating a rift within the fan base, while others were sympathetic. Many agreed that the league's marketing strategy had backfired by not focusing on what the fans genuinely wanted to watch. It was at this point that the story began to change. What had started as disappointment over a small crowd grew into a broader commentary on the WNBA's developmental challenges. The fans weren't simply not there, they were uninterested. They had disengaged emotionally once Caitlin Clark's Indiana Fever was out of the running. Without her presence on the court, casual fans stopped watching, and the finals lacked a sense of importance. While it may not have been fair to Wilson or Bonner, it was the undeniable situation. The league's struggle for identity was now being televised live. Inside the locker rooms, tensions were mounting. Players were heard discussing in hushed tones how the league had failed to capitalize on the opportunity to sustain the recent surge in popularity. A common belief was that the WNBA had overemphasized stories of rivalry and bitterness, rather than promoting a message of unity and progress. Others believed that the commissioner, Kathy Engelbert, had not done enough to close the growing divide between the established players and the new wave of fans brought in by Clark's popularity. This simmering resentment started to become public, with the frustration of A'ja and DeWanna becoming the public face of this dissatisfaction. The following day, videos of their interviews were widely shared online, igniting a new wave of controversy. Fans ridiculed the empty arenas, and critics charged the league with letting down its star players. Behind the scenes, it was reported that both players had privately expressed their anger to WNBA officials for minimizing the embarrassing situation. What had begun as disappointment was escalating into defiance, and the public was about to witness the full extent of their raw emotions. The second game of the WNBA Finals was intended to be a fresh start. The league increased its promotional activities, offered tickets at a lower price, and attempted to generate excitement on social media. However, at the start of the game, the scene was much the same. Large sections of empty seats, a quiet audience, and spectators more engaged with their phones than the game. For players like A'ja Wilson and DeWanna Bonner, This was the final insult. What happened next was not a typical emotional breakdown. It was an explosion of years of suppressed frustration, witnessed by all during a timeout in the second quarter. Cameras captured Aja forcefully throwing her towel on the bench, her anger palpable. She had a tense exchange with her teammates and shot a glare towards the stands, muttering to herself. A few moments later, Bonner was seen shaking her head in frustration after a missed shot, and then appeared to yell something towards the spectator. While the microphones did not capture her words clearly, online lip readers quickly interpreted her message. Was she saying something about no one caring? In a matter of hours, videos of both players had gone viral on sports-related social media. The fan base was immediately divided. Supporters of Aja and Bonner defended their emotional display, arguing that they were exhausted from having to carry the league without adequate backing. On the other hand, many mocked the incident, dubbing it the tantrum of the century. The comment sections of these posts were filled with sarcastic remarks. Maybe if they stopped hating Caitlin Clark, they'd have fans in the seats. The comment was cutting, but it reflected a prevalent opinion. Many felt that the veteran players who had previously belittled or ignored Clark were now experiencing the repercussions of pushing away the very audience she had attracted. The post-game press conference was thick with tension. Reporters were cautious with their questions, but one in particular ignited the situation. When asked about her evident frustration during the game, Bonner took a deep breath before answering. "It's embarrassing," she said. "We pour our hearts into this, and it's like it doesn't matter to people." Wilson, sitting next to her with a tense look, agreed. "We shouldn't have to plead for respect," she stated, her voice trembling slightly, not from anger but from sheer weariness. It was the sound of a top athlete coming to the painful realization that her efforts alone were not enough to mend the league's strained connection with its supporters. The video of this interaction was shown repeatedly. ESPN held discussions on whether the league was facing a crisis. Commentators noted that only a few months prior, Aja and others had been expressing frustration over the amount of media attention Caitlin Clark was receiving, but now they were desperate for that same level of focus. The irony was not lost on anyone. The very athletes who were once considered the faces of the WNBA had now become emblems of its difficulties. It was reported that team staff had privately advised both players to calm down and not to add to the controversy. However, the damage was already done. The tantrum had become the main story. For the first time, the narrative of the finals was not about the basketball being played, but about pride, bitterness, and the stark reality that the league's top stars were unable to draw a crowd. This was all happening without the presence of the one player they had made such an effort to eclipse. This realization was only going to escalate what was to come, a full-scale conflict of words involving players, fans, and the league itself. By the next morning, the situation had spiraled out of control. What started as on-court frustration had escalated into a major public conflict between WNBA fans and the league's own players. Social media was ablaze with countless comments, memes, and video edits making fun of Aja Wilson and DeWanna Bonner's reactions. Videos of them looking furious on the sidelines were edited with captions such as "You wanted Caitlin gone, now look around, and empty seats, don't clap back." The tone was not just mocking, it was harsh. The fans were no longer holding back. What made this criticism particularly sharp was that it was coming from the league's most dedicated followers, those who had tuned in for every Fever game, purchased merchandise, and enthusiastically shared highlights all season. These were not just online trolls, they were individuals who had invested their energy in the WNBA's expansion only to be met with a dismissive attitude from veteran players towards Caitlin Clark. The finals, instead of bringing fans together over the sport, had widened a cultural rift within it. On one side were the established players who felt the league's growth was a result of their long-standing efforts. On the other were the new fans, who saw Clark as the primary reason for the recent surge in attention. Aja's frustration only added fuel to the fire. In a tweet that was later deleted, she appeared to criticize bandwagon fans who only support a single player. While she may have intended to defend the league's overall history, the internet interpreted it differently. She was met with a flood of replies that accused her of being bitter and hypocritical. Screenshots of her tweet spread rapidly. DeWanna Bonner did not make any public posts, but her lack of comment became a statement in itself. The following day at practice, reporters noted that both stars seemed incredibly tired, not just from the games but from the constant barrage of online criticism. At the same time, the statistics were telling a story of their own. Television ratings for the finals had decreased by nearly 50% from the semi-finals, which had featured Caitlin Clark's Indiana Fever. Sports commentators could no longer overlook this. "You can feel the difference," one analyst remarked. "This isn't about the game, it's about who the fans want to see as the face of the league." This statement quickly became the defining quote of the week, repeated on every sports talk show and YouTube channel. Even players who were not involved in the finals began to speak up. Some advocated for unity, while others quietly admitted that the finals were missing the excitement that Clark provided. This was a notable instance of candidness, and it only complicated matters for Cathy Engelbert. The commissioner attempted to manage the situation by commending both teams for their tenacity and leadership. However, her words seemed empty when contrasted with the images of vacant seats on live television. For Ajay and DeWanna, the anger that had begun on the court had now fully escalated. Their emotional display had brought a difficult truth to light: the league's stars and its fans were no longer in sync. The WNBA had hoped that these finals would be a landmark event. Instead, they had become a reflection of every weakness, every resentment, and every squandered chance to maintain genuine fan engagement.
Guys, if the Fever and Caitlin Clark was playing in a finals game, let's say against the Mercury, with all that drama around there, would there be a single ticket less than $300? Now, I mean, honestly, a single ticket less than $300. I don't think so. I think you'd have courtside seats go for $5,000. If Caitlin Clark was playing, if she was in these finals along with the Fever, you are not invested. You are not interested in watching this BS transpire on your television sets.
As Game 3 approached, the silence between the players and their supporters had evolved into something much more resonant: resentment. By the time the finals advanced to Game 3, the controversy had become too significant for the league's administration to overlook. The fans were incensed, the players were exasperated, and the media was circling with intense scrutiny. So, when WNBA Commissioner Cathy Engelbert made an appearance at the pre-game press conference, it was clear to everyone that the palpable tension in the room was about to come to a head. She began with an attempt at optimism, lauding the athletes, the level of competition, and the league's significant expansion. However, her words failed to resonate against the reality of sparsely filled arenas and declining viewership. The questions from the press were immediate, pointed, and persistent. A journalist started with the question on everyone's mind: "Commissioner, how do you account for the historically low attendance and lack of fan interest in the final?" Engelbert was momentarily taken aback, then managed a strained smile and delivered a prepared statement. She pointed to scheduling issues, promotional burnout, and deceptive online narratives, but the reporters were not convinced. The next question was even more direct. Isn't this a result of how the league managed the rise of Caitlin Clark and the subsequent fan backlash? This was the turning point in the press conference. Engelbert's expression hardened, her tone became defensive, and her composed demeanor began to unravel. "This isn't about a single player," she asserted. "We have a wealth of incredible talent throughout the league." But the sharp, frustrated way she delivered the line only exacerbated the situation. In a matter of minutes, videos of her response were all over social media, and fans were quick to react. Hashtags like Jen without Caitlin and Jennerbert out started to gain traction on X and TikTok. This was more than just criticism. It was a full-blown revolt from a fan base that felt ignored. Aja Wilson and DeWanna Bonner, who had been silent since their own emotional displays, were suddenly thrust back into the center of the controversy. Engelbert's remarks made them appear as though they were in agreement with her, as if they also refused to see the obvious: that Caitlin Clark had become the central figure of the WNBA. The league's failure to accept this fact was now having negative consequences for everyone. Even analysts who had previously supported Engelbert acknowledged that her out-of-touch responses only served to widen the gap between the league's leadership and the fans who had contributed to its record-breaking viewership. The situation inside the arena was no better. Cameras swept across large sections of empty seats, and the broadcasters made a noticeable effort to avoid showing the upper levels. The tension was evident in the lack of energy, The strained looks on the players' faces and the way every unsuccessful shot seemed to carry an extra weight. The finals were no longer just about the sport. They had evolved into a test of leadership, fan devotion, and the league's very future. By the conclusion of her press conference, Engelbert appeared drained. She made an attempt to steer the conversation back to positive aspects, but it was a futile effort. The harm had been done. Her defensiveness had only fueled a fire that was already out of her control. As the headlines began to appear, Engelbert melts down. Fans revolt against WNBA leadership, empty seats, empty words. One fact became undeniable. The league was in the midst of a crisis, and its own commissioner had just made it significantly worse. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere within the WNBA had reached a critical point. Players, coaches, and league officials were all treading carefully, attempting to keep the finals on track while the league's public image was crumbling in real time. What was intended to be a high point for women's basketball had devolved into a crisis of confidence, and Kathy Engelbert's unconvincing press conference had only exacerbated the situation. In the team hotels, rumors were circulating that the players were upset, not just with the fans, but with the leadership that had put them in this predicament. It was reported that A'ja Wilson expressed her frustration in the locker room after the third game, stating that she was fed up with being made the scapegoat. "We show up, we work, we play hard, and somehow it's always our fault," she allegedly told her teammate. DeWanna, who was also present, remained silent, but her lack of response was telling. Both players had been criticized for their public displays of frustration, but they couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. The finals had turned into an embarrassing spectacle of the disconnect between the players and their fan base. The excitement, the media attention, and even the fundamental spirit of competition all seemed hollow without the energy that Caitlin Clark had brought to the league earlier in the season. Meanwhile, league executives were working frantically to mitigate the damage. Public relations teams were preparing talking points to divert interview questions away from the topic of empty arenas. Social media teams were attempting to flood their platforms with uplifting highlight reels in an effort to change the narrative. However, all these efforts seemed contrived. The fans were not being misled. They continued to share images that compared the packed arenas of Fever games to the deserted stands at the finals. The accompanying comments were scathing. "You alienated your audience," one fan commented. "Now you're just playing for yourself." Some players from other teams began to speak off the record about the increasing resentment within the league. Many of the younger athletes, who had seen firsthand how Caitlin Clark's fame had benefited everyone financially, were frustrated by the way the veteran players had treated her as an outsider. An anonymous player confessed, "A lot of us are just over the drama. We just want to see the league succeed." This candid remark highlighted a truth that the WNBA was reluctant to acknowledge. The division was not just between the fans and the league, it was between the old guard and the new generation. Engelbert convened an urgent meeting with representatives from both teams in the finals, encouraging them to concentrate on the game and to ignore the noise on social media. But at that stage, it was too little, too late. The damage had extended far beyond the basketball court. Major sports media outlets like ESPN and Fox, as well as online shows such as Black and White Sports, were all analyzing the league's collapse, presenting it as a warning about the dangers of pride, internal politics, and ineffective marketing. In the locker rooms, morale had hit rock bottom. The players were not just physically exhausted, they were emotionally spent. Every news headline felt like a personal attack. Every tweet was another sharp critique. The finals had become a matter of survival. As the pressure intensified, both A'ja Wilson and DeWanna were left with the same difficult question. If the fans had already given up, who were they still competing for? As the series approached its end, the WNBA's greatest fear was realized. The official numbers were released, and the league could no longer deny the reality of the situation. Attendance had reached an all-time low. Television viewership had decreased by almost 50% since the semifinals, and social media engagement had plummeted. What should have been the most triumphant moment of the season had become a stark reminder of the precarious nature of the league's success. The Caitlin Clark effect was no longer just a hypothesis, it was a quantifiable fact that Kathy and the players had to confront. Sports networks reported that the second game of the finals had attracted only a small fraction of the viewers that the Fever games had drawn earlier in the season. On talk shows, analysts were blunt in their assessments. The fans have made their feelings clear. One stated direct, they're interested in compelling stories, not just slogans. And at the moment, the WNBA isn't offering a story that's worth their attention. This single remark was widely circulated and became the defining commentary on the situation. It was the final decisive blow. Inside the locker rooms, both teams were well aware of the dire numbers. The players attempted to ignore them, but the headlines were unavoidable. Lowest finals ratings in a decade, one article declared. Empty seats and empty promises, read another. Even those who had consistently defended the league were now questioning its current path. The issue was not a lack of talent. The finals were filled with it. The problem was a lack of connection. The fans no longer felt a strong emotional bond with the league's top players, and the organization's unwillingness to address this growing divide only made the situation worse. For A'ja Wilson, this was a moment of truth. It was reported that she became emotional after seeing the viewership numbers. She had dedicated her entire career to establishing the legitimacy of women's basketball, and now, the most significant season of her career was being defined by indifference, rather than by her accomplishments. It hurts, she reportedly told a teammate. We did everything right on the court, but it still feels like nobody cares. Bonner shared these sentiments. Despite her extensive career, she couldn't shake the feeling that the league had lost its way. You can't ignore the fans, she quietly mentioned to a staff member. They are the ones who decide what's important. In the meantime, Cathy Engelbert held another press conference, once again trying to redirect the focus to positive growth statistics. However, the media was not persuaded. Every interview was dominated by questions about the empty seats, the players' frustration, and the backlash from the fans. She appeared increasingly on the defensive, insisting that the league was on the right track. The problem was that the data on the screen told a different story. Every statistic, every survey, every graph pointed to the same conclusion. The league, without Caitlin Clark, was not just having a hard time. It was being completely overlooked. The finals will ultimately be remembered, not for the team that won, but for what they brought to light. The WNBA's leadership could no longer ignore the fact that its most influential star was not on the court, but at home, still at the center of every discussion. As the championship trophy was presented in front of numerous empty seats, one truth was more resounding than the muted celebration. The league's future hinged on its ability to finally accept the player who had reignited the public's passion for the sport. As the confetti rained down at the WNBA Finals, the celebration had a hollow feel. The cameras made an effort to capture the joyful expressions, but the wider shots revealed a starkly different reality. More vacant chairs than enthusiastic fans, more uncomfortable quiet than celebratory noise. What was meant to be a landmark occasion for the league had instead become a critical juncture. The statistics, the visual evidence, and the fan feedback all led to the same conclusion. The WNBA had failed to capitalize on its greatest opportunity in recent memory, and the consequences were now becoming apparent. Sports commentators were quick to point this out. This finals exposed the league, one headline proclaimed. Without Caitlin Clark, the WNBA's pulse flatlined. On television talk shows and YouTube commentary channels, the discussion shifted from the game itself to the issue of accountability. The fans were no longer just criticizing the players. They were questioning whether Cathy Engelbert was the right person to be leading the league. Her curt replies to reporters, her failure to address the widening rift, and her defensive posture had escalated a leadership issue into a major crisis. Behind the scenes, league executives were scrambling to manage the situation. Meetings were held with team owners to strategize on how to handle the damage. Various ideas were proposed, including overhauling marketing approaches and working to mend the relationship with the fan base. However, the problem was more profound than just a matter of promotion. It was an issue of trust. The fans felt that they had been disrespected, marginalized, and disregarded. A large number of them had been drawn to the WNBA by the arrival of Caitlin Clark, only to be met with animosity from the very players they were encouraged to support. The finals had laid bare this unpleasant truth, and no official statement could remedy it. In the midst of this, Aja Wilson and DeWanna Bonner were at a turning point. Their public displays of frustration, which had once been seen as a sign of their passion, were now being interpreted as arrogance by a significant portion of the fan base. The emotional outbursts, the tense press conferences, and the unwelcoming attitude towards new fans had tarnished their reputation. Recognizing this, Wilson tried to adopt a more conciliatory tone in her subsequent interviews, admitting that the league needed to come together to grow. Bronzer, on the other hand, stood her ground, asserting that true fans remain loyal regardless of the circumstances. But loyalty was a luxury the WNBA could no longer take for granted. As the situation began to settle, the league was confronted with its most difficult reality to date. Growth was not a given. The phenomenon of Caitlin Clark had demonstrated that interest in women's basketball could surge, but only if the league chose to support it rather than resist it. The finals served as a stark example of what can happen when ego is prioritized over progress. The fans hadn't turned their backs on the sport. They had turned their backs on the attitude that accompanied it. By the end of the week, one phrase was dominating social media: Kathy must go. Petitions were being circulated that called for new leadership. Leadership that would actually listen to the fans and embrace a new transformative identity for the sport. Sponsors were observing the situation with concern. Television networks were rethinking their agreement. The message was unmistakable. The league could not continue to rely on pride alone. As the lights went down in the empty arena, a single unsettling question remained. Had the WNBA just experienced a much-needed wake-up call or a final warning? The answer to that question would shape the entire future of the league. When the finals concluded, the final score was irrelevant. What was significant was the silence. What should have been a triumphant moment for the WNBA had instead become a reflection of everything the league had been unwilling to face. The anger of Aja Wilson, the frustration of DeWanna Bonner, and the defensiveness of Kathy Engelbert were not just isolated incidents. They were all indications of a system that was out of touch with its audience. The fans had made their feelings known through their purchasing decisions, their social media posts, and their physical absence. They did not dislike women's basketball. They disliked being made to feel ignored. The league that had once aspired to be a symbol of unity had become divided by pride, politics, and squandered opportunities. The reality is straightforward. The WNBA's problem is not one of marketing, it is a problem of humility, and until it can learn to embrace the very player who reignited the passion of millions, every finals will be a repeat of this one, a championship contested in a void, for an audience that has already left.